All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Um, Today we're going to be tackling something that you flagged for us.
Okay.
And honestly, it's kind of a head scratcher.
Hmm.
A 50% tariff hike on telecom services in Nigeria.
Hmm.
Yeah, I know on the surface it sounds a little dry, right? Just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Huh.
But we're talking about millions of people who could suddenly be paying a lot more
Yeah.
just to stay connected.
Right.
You sent over some news articles on this, and it seems like you're really looking for the story behind the story.
Yeah.
What's the real impact going to be on people?
That's a great question, and I think it's the right one. So, on the surface, the Nigerian Communications Commission, the NCC, they're saying that this is all about rising costs for the telecom companies.
Uh,
They point out that tariffs haven't changed since 2013.
which I'm guessing in the tech world is basically a century ago.
Oh, it's a lifetime ago. I mean, think about it. Back in 2013, 4G was just starting to roll out. 5G was barely even a concept. And now Nigeria has these ambitions to be a major digital hub, right? So operators are having to pour money into new infrastructure, 5G, fiber optic cables. It all adds up.
Yeah, it's not cheap to keep up with the times, I guess.
No. And then on top of that, you have the rising cost of electricity to power all of those cell towers and just inflation in general.
Right. Right. So basically their argument is like, look, we need more money to keep the lights on and build for the future.
Yeah, essentially.
But I keep thinking back to one of the articles you sent, the one about the student who was relying on mobile data to take their classes online.
Right.
What happens to those people, if suddenly data becomes a luxury?
Yeah, and that is one of the big worries with this whole thing, affordability. I mean, even before this hike, telecom services in Nigeria weren't exactly cheap, right?
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, especially in the informal economy where mobile money is so important, their phone is their lifeline, right? A
Yeah.
50% increase could be really devastating.
And we're not talking about a small number of people either.
Yeah.
We're talking about Nigeria having over 224 million mobile subscribers.
Yeah, it's huge.
So this isn't just like a policy change. This is something that could have ripple effects across the entire country.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because this isn't the first time Nigeria has had to deal with kind of telecom troubles.
Mm.
For years, it was all state-owned, a monopoly, right? Service was notoriously unreliable.
Right.
And then finally, in the early 2000s, they liberalized the market, private companies jumped in, and mobile phone use just exploded.
So in a way, they're kind of victims of their own success, right? More users, higher demand, but the infrastructure hasn't quite caught up.
Yeah, you can definitely see it that way. And so now you've got this backdrop of past frustrations, right?
People are skeptical.
Oh, absolutely. People are skeptical. They're wondering, is this just another price hike with no real improvement in service? Or is the NCC actually going to hold these companies accountable? Are we going to see tangible benefits?
Right. So speaking of those companies, who are the big players in this?
Well, the dominant one is MTN. They have a massive 87 million subscribers.
Wow.
You've also got Globacom, Airtel, and Nine Mobile.
Okay.
And they're all facing those same cost pressures we talked about, but they're also all going to benefit from this increased revenue.
Right, of course. So we've got the players, we've got the why from the NCC's perspective, but then there's also the political angle, right?
Yes.
The communications minister came out and said that any hike wouldn't be more than 60%.
Exactly. It's like they were setting the stage, prepping people for the possibility.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, right? It shows that this isn't just about economics. It's about managing how the public sees this, managing that perception. They knew this was going to be controversial.
And they weren't wrong.
Yeah.
So we've got the argument for better infrastructure, potentially better service on the one hand, but then on the other, there are these massive affordability concerns, the potential for a digital divide. It's complicated.
Oh, it's very complex. It's
Yeah.
a lot to unpack.
Yeah, so what we're going to do now is dive a little deeper into the potential downsides of all this, really examine the impact this could have on everyday Nigerians.
Okay.
Because remember, this isn't just about numbers, it's about people's lives.
Yeah.
We'll be back in a moment to explore that side of the story.
It's so easy to get caught up in like the technical stuff, the economics of it all.
Right.
But we have to remember that at the end of the day, this is about people,
Yeah.
This is about the student who's trying to download their textbook for their online class, the grandmother who's trying to video call her family in another state,
Right.
the market vendor who relies on their phone for their business.
Absolutely. And I was thinking about that article you sent about the rise of e-commerce in Nigeria.
Yeah.
All those businesses, they rely on affordable data.
Yeah.
So if those costs go up, who ends up shouldering that burden?
Exactly.
Is it the business owner? Is it the customer? I mean, it has to trickle down somewhere, right?
It absolutely does. And then we have to think about the impact on digital inclusion, right? Nigeria has been making some real progress in bridging the digital divide, getting more people online.
Right.
But this kind of price hike could undo a lot of that work, pushing these essential services out of reach for the people who can least afford them.
Yeah, it almost feels like taking a step backwards.
Yeah.
Like, okay, you made progress, but now you're putting up this other barrier. It makes me think about what we were talking about earlier, the historical context.
Yeah.
That old state-run monopoly, the unreliable service.
Right, right.
If people start feeling like they're paying more for the same bad experience, it's just going to create resentment.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Right.
going to breed distrust, not just towards the telecom companies, but towards the NCC as the regulator as well.
If they're seen as siding with profits over people,
Yeah.
that's not a good look.
No, it's a dangerous path for sure.
Yeah.
So we've talked about affordability, the potential for a digital divide, this historical baggage.
Are there any other potential downsides that we should be thinking about?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is the impact on competition.
Okay.
Higher costs could really squeeze out the smaller players in the market,
Right.
stifle innovation.
And a less competitive market usually means fewer choices for the consumer.
Exactly. And potentially even higher prices down the line.
So it's not just about the immediate impact. It's about the long-term health of the sector as a whole.
Right. It's this whole complex ecosystem.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
But to be fair, the NCC hasn't been completely silent on these concerns, right?
No, they haven't.
They've said that they're aware of the financial pressures that a lot of households and businesses are facing.
Yeah, they've acknowledged it.
But acknowledging it and actually doing something about it are two very different things, right?
They are?
So what are some concrete steps that they could be taking to mitigate these potential downsides?
Okay, well, I think first and foremost, transparency is key. They need to go beyond just these general statements about, improving services. We need details.
Yeah.
Specific plans outlining exactly how this extra revenue is going to be used.
Like what kind of details are we talking about?
Specific targets for things like network expansion, clear timelines for upgrades,
Okay.
measurable improvements in things like download speeds and network uptime.
So basically, show me the receipts.
Exactly. Don't just tell us it's going to get better. Prove it with data.
I like that. And what about accountability? How do we make sure that these companies are actually delivering on these promises?
Well, that's where robust oversight comes in.
Okay.
Regular audits of their network performance, independent assessments of the quality of their service.
Right.
They need to be able to show with data that things are actually getting better.
So it's like data to justify the data price hike.
Yeah, pretty much. And equally important is having a really strong system in place for handling consumer complaints.
Okay.
There needs to be a very clear and accessible process for people to report issues.
Right.
And those complaints have to be taken seriously.
It's about making people feel heard.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Showing them that their concerns actually matter. Because right now, there's a lot of skepticism out there.
Yeah.
And rightfully so, right?
People have been burned before.
Exactly. So this is a big test for the NCC. Can they rebuild that trust? Can they show that this time things will actually be different?
It's a tall order for sure. But, okay, let's flip the script for a second.
Okay.
We've been focusing a lot on the potential downsides.
Yeah.
But are there any potential upsides to this tariff hike? Could this actually lead to a better digital experience for Nigerians?
It's definitely possible. I mean, if, and it's a big if, but if this increased revenue is actually used effectively,
Right.
we could see some significant improvements in the network infrastructure.
Like what?
Faster internet speeds, wider coverage, more reliable service.
Okay.
Those are all things that would benefit everyone.
So it's a potential win-win.
Yeah, but only if certain conditions are met.
Kind of a high-stakes gamble.
It is. And I think the key takeaway here is that we all need to be vigilant.
Okay.
We need to hold both the NCC and the telecom companies accountable
Quite.
and make sure that they're not just paying lip service to these concerns,
This isn't a situation where we can just sit back and wait to see what happens.
It's really not. We need to be engaged, asking questions, demanding transparency.
Yeah.
The future of Nigeria's digital landscape is at stake here.
And, this isn't just a Nigeria story either.
Right.
We're seeing these same debates around internet access, affordability, digital inclusion all over the world.
It's a global conversation.
It is, but before we get too global, let's bring it back to Nigeria.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground. The economics, the politics, the potential impacts.
Yeah.
What's the one thing you really want our listener to take away from this deep dive?
Well, I think the big takeaway here is that this isn't like a simple yes or no, good or bad kind of thing.
Right.
There are valid points on both sides.
Right.
But at the end of the day, whether this tariff hike works out or not really comes down to one thing.
What's that?
Accountability.
Okay, we've been talking about that a lot, but what does accountability actually look like in this specific case? It's a nice word, but how do we make it real?
I think it starts with transparency.
Okay.
The NCC can't just get away with these vague promises about improving services.
Yeah.
They need to come out with a detailed plan,
Like what kind of plan?
laying out exactly how they're going to use this increased revenue.
Okay, so be specific.
Exactly. Give us specific targets for network expansion, timelines for upgrades.
Okay, so like deadlines, basically.
Yeah, and we need to see measurable improvements too, right? Things
Yeah.
like download speeds and network uptime.
Yeah, so basically, don't just tell us it's going to be better. Show us the proof.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Show us the receipts and make that information public.
Yeah.
Put it out there.
Yeah.
Create dashboards, publish regular reports, even get independent auditors involved to verify everything. Okay, so that's the transparency part. But what about the enforcement side? Like, what happens if these companies don't actually meet those targets?
That's where the NCC has to be willing to step in.
So put their foot down.
Yeah, essentially. Right now, the penalties for not meeting the quality standards are pretty weak.
Okay.
They need to be strengthened to the point where these companies really feel the pressure to deliver on their promises.
So it's kind of like a carrot and a stick approach.
Yeah, exactly. Incentives for good behavior, but also real consequences if they fall short.
I like that. But remember, accountability isn't just about the telecom companies.
Oh, right.
It's about the NCC too.
Absolutely. They have to be accountable for ensuring that the market is fair, that it's competitive, that consumers are protected, that this whole thing actually benefits the entire system.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
One thing I was thinking about while we were preparing for this deep dive was how other countries have dealt with this kind of thing. Have other countries faced similar challenges? And are there any lessons that Nigeria can learn from how they handled it?
That's a great question. And yeah, there are definitely parallels. A lot of countries have had to find that balance between affordability and investing in better infrastructure. Some have put price caps in place, or they've used subsidies to help protect consumers,
Okay.
while others have focused more on encouraging competition to try and drive prices down.
So there's no magic bullet.
No, not really. But there are definitely different approaches out there that Nigeria could look at.
Yeah, and I think the key is to learn from what other countries have done, both the good and the bad.
Right. See what worked, what didn't, and think about how those lessons could be applied to Nigeria's specific situation.
So being informed, being proactive,
Yeah.
and not being afraid to experiment a little, right?
Exactly. This isn't an easy problem to solve, but it's an important one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that we're even having this conversation, that people are engaged and asking these tough questions, is a really positive sign.
I agree. It shows that Nigerians care about this, They care about what happens to their digital future.
And that's where our listener comes in, right?
Yeah.
You're the one who brought this to our attention. You sparked this whole conversation.
Now we want to hear what you think.
What are your thoughts on this? Do you think the NCC can be held accountable? Do you have any ideas for how to make sure that this tariff hike actually leads to a better digital experience for everyone in Nigeria?
Yeah, share your thoughts with us on social media using the hashtag Nigeria tariff hike.
We really want to hear your perspective.
Because ultimately, this is a conversation that belongs to all Nigerians.
And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
This is The Deep Dive, signing